welcome you all out to the unveiling of America's first doughboy marker. 100 years ago, the residents of Berrien County had this erected and placed on the out on the intersection here. And the reason they did that is because there had been a tragedy that had affected just about every community in the county almost at the end of World War I. And so everybody that came by knew the reason that marker was there. They didn't have to be told, no one had to give them the background on it. They didn't have to explain to anybody why all those names were carved into the stone. Everybody knew. Well, it's been 100 years then, since that time. And people now don't have any idea of why those names are carved on there. They don't really know what that soldier up there represents or if there's any significance to it. And so for that very reason, it was essential for the American Historical Foundation to approach the Georgia Historical Society, who's in charge of all the state markers, historical markers now, and getting them approved. And we applied for this marker for 4 years before it was finally approved, the wording on it. So that's why today we're here to unveil that marker. Unfortunately, the post didn't arrive at the same time the marker did. But if you'll envision when we unveil it, it will be located out there where the orange cone is. That was where the post will be, and that's where the marker will be set. But we appreciate you being here today for this occasion, so that from this point forward, there will be no reason why people shouldn't understand and know the purpose of these names and what happened to their lives and why their lives are still being recognized 100 years later. We have some special guests with us. I'm hoping that they're here. State Senator Tyler Harper. I don't know if Tyler's here today. State Senator Russ Goodman, representing Cook and Lanier County. And State Representative Penny Houston, of course. Penny's here, representing Berrien and Cook County. We also have the mayors from each one of the counties indicated that they may be here, and the city council. We have most of the city councilmen from Nashville, I believe, here. We also have representatives from the General James Jackson chapter of the National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Floyd Luke is here with us, and she has a representative, some friends and other associates that are with her as well, and we are glad to have them with us, and she's going to participate in the program as well. I want to make a special point to thank the generous contributors shown on the back of your program, whose donations made this marker possible. It took 4 years to pay for the original Doughboy statue back in 1918 and through 1920. But it took less than 6 weeks to raise the $2,500 to pay for our portion of the historical marker. So I appreciate those people who are so generous with their offerings. I'd also like to acknowledge the help that we had by Elise Butler from the Georgia Historical Society, who walked through and insisted that we had this marker and had to help us get it approved by changing the wording and working with us and doing some of the research to help us out on it so that we could finally get the approval. And because of the state limitation on the coronavirus, she wasn't allowed to be here today, but I want you to know and acknowledge her help in it. I'd like to thank Gail Bailey and Nancy's husband. I apologize, I don't remember your name. Is it Alex? With those in attendance today whose ancestors made up the ultimate sacrifice during the Great War, as World War I was often called. Max and Mickey Hancock from Moultrie, Georgia, whose ancestor, Private Robert J. Hancock, lost his life on the sinking of the Otranto. That was his uncle. Judge Susan Griner and her daughter Suzanne Garnett, whose ancestor Private Shelley Webb also lost his life on the Otranto disaster. That was Judge Griner's great uncle and Suzanne's second great uncle that lost his life. So thank you all for the contributions, and thank you those that have come here and set a few minutes aside today for this special occasion. Now, if you'll please stand for the presentation of colors by the Sylvester G.A.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, with liberty and justice for all.
Colors. Right. Face. Forward. Mark.
Now you can go ahead and be seated. Thanks again to the Sylvester ROTC. You know what it means to young men to give up their Saturdays to come over and help us out here, and we're grateful for that. Fine young gentlemen. Jane Knight is one of the founders. She and her husband, Judge Jack Knight, made the creation of the Berrien Historical Foundation possible back in 1995. And we're so grateful for that. They took the time and decided it was time that the history of Berrien County be preserved. And one of those things that we needed to recognize and not forget is the contribution and the sacrifice made by the gentlemen whose names are listed on this monument. And Jane's going to give us a little background on the circumstances surrounding the events of the Otranto and that particular marker that's on top that we call America's first doughboy. Jane, here.
Though I do want to recognize the city, people that are here. John Blake, the mayor pro tem, Antonio Carter is here, Billy Reddebush is here, and Walt Stewart is here. And a little bit about Walt. Walt assured me before the program started that 11 o'clock the clock was going to strike. And did you check your watches? Strike at 11 o'clock. So thank you, Walt, and all of your crew that comes and helps you do our clock. We end of the Great War was just 6 weeks away when the wooden hull luxury liner HMS Otranto crossed the Atlantic laden with young Americans. And to defy the German submarines, they were surrounded by a group of British fleet to protect them. But stormy weather conditions prevented correct navigation, and the Otranto had to go on its own. When dawn broke on October the 6th, 1918, a treacherous rocky coast was sighted. Most ships correctly identified it as Scotland, but not the Otranto. They thought that it was Ireland. The Otranto turned north into the path of another ship, the Kashmir, which was also carrying some fleets, slicing a gaping hole in the engine room. The Otranto remained afloat, but was rapidly taking on water. The Kashmir was not badly damaged, and following military protocol, continued on its voyage and left the Otranto and its full load of soldiers there on their own to die in the water. The Otranto was dead. However, an extraordinary rescue mission on the high seas took place. There was a British escort there, the HMS Mounsey, and it had a crew, and it saved 596 men. Excuse me. And one of the accounts that I read about this was that the Mounsey came aside of the Otranto, which was rapidly sinking, and it urged the men to jump from one ship to the other in high seas and in a storm. So many of them did not have their timing just right, and many of them died in that rescue operation. And some of them drowned, some of them were crushed between the two ships, which is just the saddest thing for me to think of those boys giving their lives to go over and fight, and then having to face that hardship. There were more than 400 boys left behind in the water. Only 21 men, 17 of those that were survivors, managed to swim to the shore, which was more than 500 yards. And they were on the Isla, and they were dragged ashore by the local people of that island. But thinking back to what I just told you of how the rescue tried to take place, it was mostly bodies that were drowned or they had their heads crushed that floated upon the shore that the people tried to rescue. The following morning, the coast was strewn with scores of dead. In a remarkable display of public sympathy, local people scoured the beaches, and men roped themselves together and propelled down cliffs in an effort to rescue anybody who was alive and to save the bodies, collect the bodies of those that were dead. Historical Roman Church became a morgue. 100 bodies were stretched out on 100 pews. When the church got full, they resorted to the graveyard, where they stretched out 100 more dead among the gravestones. The islanders buried these several hundred dead strangers in a moving and dignified ceremony. In America, the sense of shock was overwhelming. The New York Times broke the story front page and gave the horrifying details. Nowhere in the world was the shock more profoundly felt than it was in Berrien County when they heard that the boys that they had sent off to help fight in the war were among those who were on the Otranto. Eventually, parents, friends, the community learned the troops rolled from the Otranto. Listed on that ship's roll, there were 25 boys from Berrien County. I should say men, anybody that's risking their life like that. They were no longer boys. Their homes were in every community in Berrien County. Nashville, Milltown, Cecil, Arapahoe, Adel, Lenox, Ray City, and Enigma. Each one of those communities suffered a big loss. Another sad thing to me was that the families had to wait patiently and painfully for news about the Otranto. Surely, if almost 600 survived, most or not all would be our boys, the Berrien County mothers thought. But the news did not come the next day or the next week. In some cases, several weeks passed before the final word came that your son was among those who did not survive. Only 3 families of men who left from Berrien County had their prayers answered, and their 3 sons lived. By the time the Otranto families had learned of their sons and husbands' fate, the armistice had signed and the war had ended. In 1920, bodies of the American soldiers were returned to their families for reburial, thus prolonging the grief that those families suffered. No other county in Georgia was so greatly impacted as was the loss of the number and the terrible thing that had happened to the boys from Berrien County. Almost immediately, there was a call around the nation to recognize those soldiers who had paid the ultimate price in the Great War. One sculptor in particular, who at that time was living in Americus, Georgia, and working for a company there, within just a few months of hearing this, he created what would become one of the most recognized monuments in the United States. Ernest McKinney is the one who came up with this copper-clad sculpture of a soldier dressed in full battle gear, striding through barbed wire. He's got his rifle in his hand, one hand, and a grenade in the other, with the hand raised there, and he was ready to fight. And he titled this, "The Spirit of the American Doughboy." With the tragedy of the Otranto still particularly painful part of Berrien County's lives, Berrien residents were eager to memorialize the sacrifices that their families had made, as well as they wanted to share the other families, even though they were not from Berrien County, they wanted to share their grief. Mr. McKinney created a miniature doughboy, little sculpture, and he carried it around to all the communities around the United States, taking orders. But the first in line to get a memorial was Berrien County. We were the very first who got the doughboy, and we paid for the doughboy. Eventually, over 150 communities purchased the doughboy. Now, not all of them are exactly the same. He had several patterns that he later used, but this is the original. The sculpture was purchased in 1920, as Brian also already said. It was not until 1923 that the Berrien County citizens could raise enough money for the granite pedestal that this sculpture sits upon today. They were also very proud of the monument and their boys whose names were inscribed on it. They placed it in the middle of the intersection. It was in the, as Brian told you, it was out there when the road was dirt. I don't think I remember that, but it might be, I think I remember it because it was such a big thing in our lives when we were growing up. This was the most important thing on the square to me, was coming over here and look at this monument. Now, not that I understood what it was about, but I knew it was something important. Later it was moved to where it now stands. That was in 1941. For many years, the mothers of fallen soldiers, called Gold Star Mothers, gathered here at this monument in a solemn ceremony to honor the memory of not only our boys in that war, but the boys that belonged to other mothers and fathers throughout the country. And at the bottom is cast the saying, "We gather here lest we forget." Certainly now, we as citizens of Berrien County and others who will finally pass this marker one day and wonder about it, I hope that we never forget what Berrien County families did during the Great War. And we today want to reaffirm and pledge our honor to all the men who gave their lives. And the final thing I want to say is, let's always remember that, so that we won't be the ones who forget. Thank you.
I appreciate Jane for doing that and sharing that. I think we'll go ahead and have the unveiling, and we'll have Mr. Hancock come up and help me, and we'll have Judge Webb and her daughter come forward, and Suzanne Garnett and Susan Webb, and I'll let you. Squeeze it and lift it off. You ready?
Today I'll be reading to you the historical marker text. Spirit of the American Doughboy. Following the United States entry into World War I, more than 100,000 Georgians were involved in the war effort, with the state suffering over 1,000 casualties. The rural community of Berrien County experienced an extraordinary high rate of loss, particularly in 1918 sinking of the troop ship HMS Otranto, the greatest maritime disaster of the war. Answering President Woodrow Wilson's call to honor those who died in the war, Berrien County commissioned the first Doughboy statue sculpted by America's Georgia resident Ernest Moore Vacani. Completed in 1921, the statue was unveiled in 1923 when the community raised the funds to acquire and install it. Known as the Spirit of the American Doughboy, the design was replicated all over the country to memorialize soldiers lost during World War I, erected by the Georgia Historical Society and Berrien Historical Foundation.
thank you so much for participating in that. It's a special honor to be the ones that get to unveil that, and I appreciate you being here to do that. Susan and her father were great advocates of the promotion of history of Berrien County, and this marker was an essential part of it, and we're grateful that they were here to be a part of the program today. Thank you. We now have the laying of the wreath by the daughters of the Society of Daughters of the American Revolution, Miss of the Taps. That concludes our program this morning. However, we'd like to invite you to visit the Berrien County Museum and Archive inside the courthouse, view its military and historical display. One of the things that I'm most proud of is, first of all, we're grateful for the support of the county commissioners and county residents for maintenance of this building, where it can preserve the history of its county. But I'm also grateful for the Berrien Historical Foundation members and citizens and people that donate to the foundation. All of the exhibits that you'll see inside were all paid for through private donations. There is no government money for any of the exhibits or anything that paid for that. And all of the time that is spent in building the displays and purchasing the materials for it all come from volunteers and donations. So enjoy yourself, stay as long as you'd like. I'm not anxious to close up the courthouse, so feel free to stay as long as you'd like. And thank you all for coming. This monument will be a very special monument for a number of years, I'm sure. Thank you again.